The swarm came off the Lime Avenue at 4 in the afternoon on the day of her wedding, and by the time the carriage turned in at the gates of Ashcombe, the whole of the forecourt was screaming. Alethea Sowerby heard it before she saw it. She knew the sound of a swarm the way other women know the sound of a kettle, and this one had gone flat and hard and angry, which meant somebody was doing something to it. There were perhaps 60 people in the gravel forecourt, and the long canvas awning raised over the trestle tables had a great brown living beard hanging from its ridgepole, 4 feet of it swaying. The bees had settled an hour since. 2 footmen had beaten at them with napkins, a groom had thrown a bucket of water, and a keeper had gone for straw and a torch and was at that moment kneeling in the wet gravel striking a light. Under the awning, directly beneath the hanging weight of them, a boy of about 7 stood absolutely still, with his arms at his sides. He was the cook's grandson. He had been told not to move, and he was obeying, and his face had gone the color of the tablecloth. On the steps of the house, a tall man in a dark coat stood with his hands behind his back and watched. He was not shouting. He said something quiet to the keeper, and the keeper bent lower over the torch. Alethea opened the carriage door herself and stepped down into the gravel in her wedding clothes. "Put that out," she said. Nobody heard her. She had a small voice, and she had learned young that there is no use in trying to make a small voice into a large one. So she walked, instead, straight through the middle of the shouting, and took the burning straw out of the keeper's hands and laid it face down in a puddle, and it went out with a sound like a sigh. "You will not burn them," she said, into the sudden quiet. "You will not smoke them, you will not beat them, and you will not throw one more thing at them. They are not angry, they are tired, and they are wet, and they have nowhere to sleep. If you keep hitting a tired thing, it will eventually oblige you." "Go back to the wall," Alethea said, "all of you quietly, and do not run, because running is the one thing they understand as an insult." She had a plain willow queen cage in her pocket. It had been her mother's worth about 2 pence, worn shiny at the mouth by 40 years of use, and she had carried it at her own wedding that morning for reasons she was not prepared to examine. She looked at the boy. "What is your name?" "Tobit." "Mrs. Tobit, you are being extremely brave, and you are also being brave in the wrong place. When I say so, you are going to walk backwards, slowly, 7 steps, and a woman in a blue apron is going to take hold of you." "Not yet." It was a good one. 2 pounds of bees, perhaps 3. Prime swarm off an old stock that had been let alone too long, which told her more about the state of Ashcombe than an hour with the account books would have done. She held out her hand palm upward and waited, and the rain fell, and 60 people held their breath against a wall. Bees walked onto her hand. First 1, then a dozen, then 100, coming down the outside of the cluster in the unhurried way of a crowd leaving a church. She let them run up her sleeve and along her shoulder, and she began to hum low on one note, which does nothing to a bee at all and a great deal to a woman standing under 3 pounds of them in her wedding dress. "Now, Tobit, backwards." Slowly, the boy went backwards. A woman in a blue apron seized him and carried him away. "Now, Tobit," she said, "backwards, slowly." Alethea watched the surface of the cluster the way another woman might read a face, looking for the place where the bees went 2 directions at once, and after 4 minutes she found it. She put her fingers in among them and took the queen out, between finger and thumb. She put the queen into the willow cage and shut it and held it up level with her shoulder and stood there in the rain with her arm out, perfectly still for the 2 minutes it takes. Then the note changed. It went up and it went round and it lost its hard flat edge, and the whole brown weight of them came off the awning in a single roll and poured through the air and settled on her hand and her arm and her shoulder and the whole right side of her body, and she stood under the ruined awning wearing about 30,000 bees. "A skep," she said pleasantly, "or a basket, or a hat box, anything with a lid and a hole in it, and be quick, because I am not as calm as I look." They brought her a wicker fish creel from the kitchens. She set the cage in the bottom of it and let them walk in over the rim, and tipped it gently onto its side with a folded napkin under it to leave a doorway, and sat back on her heels in 4 inches of water. Her dress was ruined past mending. Her hair had come down on one side, and there was a bee walking across her collarbone that she could not be bothered to remove. She looked up at the steps. He had come down 2 of them. He was younger than the coat made him, 33 or so. Dark, dry-featured, with the kind of stillness that other people mistake for calm, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read at all, and she was to spend the next 2 years failing to read it. "You are unhurt," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am very wet, Your Grace." "Take that thing to the orchard," he said to the keeper without moving his eyes from her. "Nobody burns anything at Ashcombe today." Then he turned and went up the steps and into his house, and Alethea Sowerby, who had been the Duchess of Caldermere for 6 hours, picked her mother's veil up off the trestle table and shook the rain out of it. Pesketh had watched the whole of it from the shelter of the doorway with his hands folded, which was what he did with his face when he did not wish it read. He came down 1 step to his master, who had paused inside the open door. "Your Grace, shall I have the east chamber opened for her Grace? It has been shut, but the girls could have it aired by 9. "No," said the Duke of Caldermere, "the west rooms will do for her." And then, in a lower voice, in the tone of a man setting down something heavy, "She is not the woman I meant to bring into this house, Hesketh. Let us not dress it up between us." Hesketh stood in the loud rain of the doorway and said nothing, which was his profession. But in 44 years at Ashcombe, he had never once seen a swarm come down to a stranger's hand, and he had never once seen the keeper's torch put out by anybody. Also, though neither man knew it, the new Duchess of Caldermere was standing a dozen feet inside the passage with her mother's veil in her arms, and had heard every word, and there was still a bee in her hair. The thing nobody at Ashcombe knew about, Alethea Sowerby, was not a shameful thing. That was rather the trouble with it. A shameful thing can be confessed and survived. Hers could not. Her father had been Barnabas Sowerby of Nettleford, wax chandler and bee master, a big, slow, gentle man with a shop on the market square and 40 stocks of bees on the common beyond it. He had never in his life been able to add a column of figures twice and get the same answer. Her mother had done the books. When her mother died, Alethea, being 14, had done the books. By 19, she was doing the whole of it. The buying and the contracts and the wages of 11 people, under her father's name, because a name on a door is a useful thing to hide behind. When Barnabas died in the spring of the year she was 21, there was no son to take it, there being no son, and there never had been. The business simply went on. Nobody in the wax trade in 3 counties had the least idea that the firm they dealt with was a young woman in a back room with a candle and a good memory. She had made a great deal of money. That was the secret. Not her father's money. Hers. £11,000 of it in 8 years, out of wax and honey and a naval contract that nobody had wanted to bid for, because the terms were wicked, and Alethea had read the terms 4 times and found the place where they were not. And when the Duke of Caldermere's man of business came to Nettleford in the autumn looking for a marriage that would put ready money into a failing estate, and was directed to the late Barnabas Sowerby's orphan daughter, everyone understood the arrangement perfectly. A dead chandler's fortune, a duchess made out of tallow. The county laughed about it for a fortnight. So the settlement was made, and the money went into Ashcombe. And Alethea let them believe it was her father's, because the alternative was to stand up in front of the county and say she had made it herself. A duchess who had traded was a scandal that would follow the family for 3 generations. Worse, her uncle Crispin Otway was named in her father's will as trustee to a business he believed his brother had run. And if he ever learned who had really run it, he would have it out of her hands inside a 12-month, because a man does not need to prove a woman incapable. He only needs to say so. There was one other clause. The 11,000 had not gone into Ashcombe as a gift. It had gone in as a bond, on the advice of an attorney in Nettleford who was fond of her, drawn and signed and witnessed a full week before the wedding while she was still her own woman-in-law, and redeemable at her own word at any time after 7 years. She had signed it and put it in the bottom of a plain deal box under her mother's queen cage, and never once mentioned it to her husband, and told herself firmly that this was prudence. It was not prudence. She had known that even at the time, it was the small, hard, sensible corner of a woman who has been alone since she was 14, keeping one door unlocked behind her. She meant to be a good wife. She had married for the ordinary reasons, which were that she was tired of being the only wakeful person in her own life, and that the Duke of Caldermere had come to Nettleford himself before the settlement was signed and said he would not pretend to a warmth he did not feel, but that she would be treated with every courtesy in his house for as long as she lived in it, and that he did not lie. She had thought it a cold thing to say, and an honest one, and that she had been offered worse bargains by warmer men. She had not understood until the wedding night, standing in a west bedroom listening to the rain, that he had told her the exact truth, and she had not known how to hear it. The house was dying. It took her 3 weeks to see how and 4 months to understand why, and the two answers were not the same answer at all. It was a beautiful place. That was the pity of it. Ashcombe Hall lay long and low in a fold of ground with an avenue of limes going up to it, and a walled orchard of 9 acres behind, and it was going quietly to the bad, in the way a strong man goes to the bad, from the inside slowly, with nobody willing to say the word. The orchard had 90 stalks of bees in her husband's grandfather's day. She counted 12, and 4 of those were failing. 9 acres of apple and pear went unpollinated, and the crop had halved in 6 years, and nobody at Ashcombe had connected the two facts because nobody at Ashcombe had looked. The roof over the long gallery had been leaded in the year 1790, and never touched since. There was a bucket in the gallery, old enough to have worn a place in the floor beneath it. 9 cottages at Draymore wanted thatch. The rents had gone up at Michaelmas. The plate was tarnishing in the drawers, and 2 of the great rooms stood shuttered and smelled of damp. 9 cottages at Draymore wanted thatch. The rents had gone up at Michaelmas, and the household accounts were kept by Mr. Osric Pell, the Duke's man of business, who held the keys of the muniment room and the plate room and the cellars and the estate office, and had worn the housekeeper's ring on his own belt since old Mrs. Nairn died 4 years before and was never replaced. Her husband was unfailingly courteous to her. He rose when she came into a room. He asked after her health at breakfast, in the same words every morning. He signed whatever she put before him, and told her that whatever she thought best would be best. He had never once been unkind to her, and in 4 months he had never once been alone with her by choice, and he had never called her by her name. The east chamber was kept locked. It was aired twice a week, and there were fresh flowers put in it every Friday by a maid who did it without being told, and nobody slept in it, and nobody spoke of it. And on the last Friday of every month the Duke of Caldermere rode out at 7 in the morning alone and came back after dark, and never said where he had been, and nobody in that house had ever once asked him. She had married an occupied one. Lady Theodosia Varell was 79, the Duke's great-aunt, and she had lived in the Yellow Room for 22 years, because it was the only room in the house that got the whole of the afternoon. She had buried a husband, 2 brothers, a nephew, and every one of her own contemporaries, and she missed absolutely nothing. On the first afternoon she looked Alethea up and down and said, "You are not what I was told. I am sorry, ma'am." "Do not be sorry. Sorry is a wasted breath, and I have not many left." "I said you were not what I was told. I did not say I was displeased. There is a difference, and if you mean to survive in this family, you had better learn to hear it." She tapped the arm of the chair. "Sit. I am told you took a swarm off the awning on your wedding day with your bare hands. It was not as remarkable as it sounded, ma'am. A swarm has no home to defend. It is the gentlest thing in the world if you leave it alone. Do not do that," said Lady Theodosia. "Do not make yourself small in this house. There are enough small people in it already, and they have made a very poor job of the place. You have been here 19 days. Tell me what you have seen, and do not be tactful. I have no time left for tactful. I gave it up along with dancing, so Alethea told her. There is a particular relief in being asked a true question by somebody who wants the true answer, and she had been holding it in for 19 days. She told her about the 12 stocks and the 9 acres, the bucket in the gallery, the thatch at Draymore, the rents raised at Michaelmas. She told her carefully about Mr. Pell, who kept every key and settled every account and could not be told his business by anybody. "And my nephew," she said when Alethea had stopped. "Your ladyship, I would rather not." "I know you would rather not. Answer me anyway." Alethea looked at the fire. "He is very kind to me," she said. "He has never raised his voice to me. He has never asked me a single question about myself. He does not know what my father's trade was. I have been his wife for 4 months, and I could tell you the whole of what he knows about me in one breath, and none of it would be a thing I told him. That is a great deal worse than complaining, and you may take that from a woman who complained for 50 years and found it very sustaining." The old eyes came up. "My nephew is not a cold man, and he is not a cruel one. Cruelty would be easier. You could fight cruelty. He is faithful, which is the worst thing, because there is nothing in this world you can do about faith. He has been faithful for a decade and more to something that cannot be argued with, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot ever be disappointed, for the simple reason that it is not here." Alethea sat very still. "And what is it?" "A memory," said Lady Theodosia, "or a woman. In my experience there is not always a great difference between the two." She turned her head to the window. "There is a thing you ought to be told about the year he was 23. I shall not tell it to you today. Do not press me, child. I shall tell you when you are strong enough to hear it and stay in this house afterward, and you are not strong enough yet, now. I am going to make you useful, because a woman with nothing to do in this house will go mad in a 12-month. I cannot give you the household. Pell has the keys, and my nephew will not take them off him. But I am the last person alive that Osric Pell is afraid of. The still room is yours. The orchard and the hives are yours, and if you can put 9 acres back into fruit, you will have done more for this estate than any man in it these 6 years. And the poor fund is yours, 300 a year, mine to give, and you will find that it buys you a great deal more than thatch. Your ladyship, I am the Duchess. Should I not simply be given the house?" "You should," said Lady Theodosia. "You will not be. You have 3 small things instead, and I suggest you use them, because the whole of a house can be got at through any one of its doors, provided a woman is willing to go the long way round." Alethea went the long way round. She began with the hives, because a hive is a household in miniature and tells the truth faster than a ledger. 4 of the 12 were queenless, and she united them. 2 had calm black as a chimney, and she cut it out and rendered it down and got 9 pounds of good wax out of what everybody had assumed was rubbish. She bought 7 skeps and 2 swarms at Nettleford Fair for £1 11 shillings, which was the entire sum she spent that spring, and by the end of August she had 40 stocks standing in the orchard. Corbin Wick came to help her. He was 70 and had been bee master at Ashcombe for 42 years, and had not been asked to do anything with the bees in 6 of them, because nobody had remembered that the bees were a thing to be done. He arrived at the orchard gate on the 3rd morning without being sent for, watched her hands for 10 minutes, and said, "Your Grace has done that before. Once or twice, Mr. Wick." The still room came next. She turned it out and found 3 years of spoiled preserves, and at the very back a set of shelves that had plainly belonged to somebody, careful neat labels in a round young hand. Cordials and rosewater and quince, all gone to ruin. None of it touched in years. There was no name on the labels. Alethea cleaned every jar and kept every label, and did not ask whose they were, because it seemed to her a cheap sort of thriftiness to throw away another woman's handwriting. She had the gallery roof looked at, which cost £4, and stopped the bucket. She had the 9 cottages at Draymore thatched out of the poor fund at 2 shillings and 3 pence a yard, and paid the thatcher at the door in her own hand, and wrote it in her own book. And in the middle of all this, she did a thing that nobody saw and nobody was told about. Corbin Wick had 4 stocks of his own behind his cottage, which were his savings, an old man's whole estate standing on 4 legs of brick. In the last week of May, the best of them threw a swarm and lost it into the beach hangar, and Wick went after it, and came back grey in the face. Alethea walked into the beach hangar at 8 in the evening with her mother's cage in her pocket, took the swarm out of a holly, carried it back 1.5 miles in a creel, and hived it behind his cottage while he was asleep. In the morning he found 4 stalks standing where 3 had stood, and never said one word about it to her or to anybody else for the rest of his life. The Duke of Caldermere noticed her the way a man notices a change in the weather, which is to say all at once and without wanting to. He did not go to the orchard or the still room, but he could not help observing that there was fruit on the table in September for the first time in 4 years, and that the tenants at Draymore, who had touched their hats to him for 6 years in a way that made him feel like a debt collector, now did it in an entirely different manner, and he could not think why, and did not ask. And in October he came up to his own room at midnight, and found that the candles had been changed. He had used tallow all his life because his father had used tallow, and because nobody had ever thought about it. Tallow smokes. It had been giving the Duke of Caldermere a headache behind his right eye for years, and he had never once connected the 2 things. There were beeswax candles in the sticks, 4 of them, plain, unstamped, burning clean and steady and yellow and smelling like the inside of the orchard in July. He stood and looked at them. In the morning he said to Hesketh, "Who changed the candles in my room?" In the morning he said to Hesketh, "Who changed the candles in my room?" "Her Grace, your Grace." Her Grace poured them, your Grace in the still room. 240 of them, over about a fortnight. There are enough now for the whole house through the winter, and her Grace has instructed that the tallow be sent down to the laundry rather than waste it. A small pause. She said a man who reads until 2 in the morning ought not to have to do it through smoke. She also said not to mention it. "Then why have you mentioned it?" "'Cause your Grace asked me a direct question," said Hesketh, "and I have never yet found a way round one of those." Something crossed the Duke's face that was gone before it arrived. It was 3 weeks later that Alethea found the letter. She had been in the library to return a book of her aunt's, which was where she found herself most evenings now, because he was there, and neither of them ever remarked on it. They talked of nothing. Once he asked whether it was true that bees would work themselves to death if you let them, and she said that they would in a good year, and that it was the one thing about them she had never been able to forgive. That evening he was not there. The fire was low, and the book she wanted was on the 3rd shelf, and when she pulled it out a folded paper came with it and went onto the boards at her feet. She picked it up to put it back. She was not a woman who read other people's letters. She had it half returned to the shelf before her eye, which read handwriting the way other people read faces, told her 3 things about the paper in her hand. It was a woman's hand. It was recent, within the 12-month, because the ink had not gone brown. And whoever she was, she had written to this house often enough that the writing had worn a groove in the man who read it, because the fold of the paper was soft as cloth and the crease had been opened and shut so many times that it had begun to tear. Then she folded it back along its own worn crease, exactly as it had been, and put it exactly where it had been at the same depth, with the same edge outward, and pushed the book in after it, and went upstairs and sat on the end of her bed with her hands in her lap. She did not open it. Let us pause there for one moment. If you are enjoying this story, and you would like to hear the rest of it, and the others that come after, do take a second to subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you would think. Now back to Ashcombe. The discrepancy was £4. She found it in the last week of November, the way she found everything, by keeping her own book and comparing it with somebody else's. The poor fund was hers, 300 a year, Lady Theodosia's own money, paid quarterly through the estate office, because that was how it had always been done, and drawn on by Alethea against her own written vouchers. In November she went to settle the thatcher, and the estate office ledger showed the Draymore thatching at £42, and Alethea's book showed 38, and the thatcher's own tally, which he brought to the back door because he could not write and used a notched stick like his father before him, showed 38. £4. It was nothing. It was a tenth part of the sum, on one small job, in one small quarter. She did not go to her husband, and she did not go to Pell, and she did not say a word to a living soul. She went upstairs and began, that night, to keep a second book. The second book was different. In it she wrote what things actually cost, taken from the mouths of the people actually paid. The thatcher, the lime burner, the corn factor, the Nettleford carrier, who charged the estate 12 shillings a load and was paid 9. She had a reason to speak to all of them, because the orchard and the poor fund gave her business at the back door 4 days out of 6, and nobody thinks twice about a duchess who is buying skeps. By the end of January she had a figure. Ashcombe was paying out, on paper, about £600 a year more than it was actually spending. And on the 4th page from the end, there was an entry she could not make agree with anything at all. A house at Nettleford, rent paid quarterly, coal, £10 a year, wages of a cook and a maid, repairs in the spring of the previous year to the sum of £19, 6 years of it, going back further than her marriage, further than the settlement, further than anything. Nettleford was her own town. She knew every house in it that a gentleman might take. There was no such property on any estate map and none in any rent roll, and the entries did not come out of the general account at all. They came, every quarter for 2 years, out of the money she had brought into that house herself. Alethea sat with the book open on her knee and the beeswax candle burning clean beside her, and she did not weep, and she did not sleep, either. On the 5th day, Adeline Charteris came to Ashcombe. She came at 2 in the afternoon in a hired chaise with 7 trunks and a maid, and she came, as Alethea understood, within about 90 seconds, not as a visitor but as a returning inhabitant. Alethea was crossing the hall with a basket of wax when the doors opened. She saw the servants first, which is always the way to read an arrival. Hesketh went absolutely still. Mrs. Pinnock put her hand over her mouth. Nobody looked surprised. Every person in that hall knew who it was, and every one of them had known she was coming, and not one had told the Duchess. She was 31, and beautiful in the hard, bright way that survives weather and money troubles. And when she came in out of the cold, she stopped in the middle of the floor and looked up at the ceiling with an expression of enormous, weary, unguarded relief, like a woman coming back to a room she had been thrown out of. Then she saw Alethea and put the expression away. "Ah, you will be the Duchess," she said. "Adeline Charteris." She put out her hand and shook Alethea's like a man. Her glove was worn through at the seam of the thumb, mended, and mended well, which Alethea noticed and understood and filed. "I am a widow, and I am a cousin of nobody in this house, whatever they tell you in the village, and Aldous has offered me the dower house because my husband died in debt and left me £110 a year, and I have nowhere else on God's earth to go. You may as well have all of that from me directly, because you will have a much worse version of it from your kitchen inside 2 days." That was very honest. "It was not honest at all," said Adeline. "It was quick. There is a difference, and you will find it out." And she went past her up the stairs, and she went up them without asking anybody the way. "It was not honest at all," said Adeline. "It was quick. There is a difference, and you will find it out." And she went past her, up the stairs, and she went up them without asking anybody the way. The Duke came in from the land at 4. Alethea was on the landing with the wax still in her arms and saw the whole of it from above, which is the worst possible place from which to see anything. He came into the hall. He saw Adeline standing by the fire. And the man Alethea had lived with for 14 months, the man who rose when she entered a room and asked after her health in the same words every morning and had never once called her by her name, went across that hall in about 4 strides and took hold of both of Adeline Charteris's hands and stood there holding them and said something too low to be heard, and his face was open. Alethea had never seen his face open. She had not known that it did that. She went along the landing and down the back stairs and out through the still room door into the orchard and stood among 40 hives in the cold, with her breath going up white, and after a while began methodically to check the mouse guards, because they wanted checking and because her hands had to be doing something. Mr. Osric Pell found her there 20 minutes later. Mr. Osric Pell found her there 20 minutes later. He was a soft, comfortable pink man of about 45, who smiled a great deal, and had a way of arriving in a place without seeming to have walked to it. He stood in the orchard gate in his good coat with the mud going over his shoes, which told her he had come out on purpose. "Your Grace is out late. The mice get in at the hives in a hard frost, Mr. Pell. So they do." He looked round at the neat rows with an expression of great benevolence. "It is a wonderful thing what your Grace has done out here. 40 stocks! We have not had 40 stocks at Ashcombe since the old Duke's time." 41, said Alethea. "Mr. Wick took a late one in September." 41, said Alethea. "Mr. Wick took a late one in September. Your Grace has a head for figures. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. May I offer a word of counsel? Not as a servant of the family. As one person of business to another." "This is a very old house," said Mr. Pell pleasantly, "with a great many arrangements in it that are older than your Grace's marriage and will very likely outlast it. A lady who is new here does best to keep to what she has been given. It is when a lady begins to go about the county asking tradesmen what they were paid that people commence to wonder what she is looking for, and then they commence to wonder what she is." No. Pell's smile did not move at all. "Then let me put it plainer. There is a firm of wax chandlers at Nettleford that trades under the name of Sowerby. I wrote to them in October about the estate's candles, and the reply came in a hand I had seen before, on the vouchers of the Ashcombe Poor Fund." He put his head a very little on one side. "His Grace does not know his wife is in trade. The county does not know it. Your Grace's uncle at Marchbank does not know it either, and I am told he is a gentleman with strong views on what a woman may have the keeping of." The orchard was very quiet. Alethea looked at him steadily and saw, under the pink and the smile and the good coat, for about half a second, the thing she had been waiting to see. He was frightened of her. He had not come out here in his good shoes to threaten a woman who was no danger to him. He had come because a duchess with a book had been standing too near his door for 9 weeks, and he did not know how much she had, and it was keeping him awake. "I keep excellent accounts, Mr. Pell," she said. "It is the one habit of mine that has never yet inconvenienced an honest man. Mind the mud on your way back. It goes over the boot at the second gate." She did not go to her husband. She did not go to her husband. She thought about it for 9 days, and she had 3 reasons, and she made herself name all 3 of them honestly on the last night. The first was that he would not believe her. A man does not want to be told by a stranger that the woman he has loved half his life is being kept out of his wife's money by his own man of business. The second was that she had no proof of the thing that mattered. She had £600 of leakage and a house with no name on it, and Pell would say the house was an act of charity to a widow, and it would be true, and it would not be the whole truth, and the whole truth was the only kind that would survive being said out loud in that house. The third was cowardice, and she wrote the word down in pencil so that she could look at it. If she moved against Pell, Pell would tell them what she was. Not a duchess with a dead father's money, a tradeswoman, a shopkeeper who had bought a title with wax. Her uncle would have Sowerby and company out of her hands inside a year, and her husband, who was courteous to her every morning at breakfast, would look at her the way he had looked at her in the rain on their wedding day. Better to keep her head down. Better to mend the thatch and keep the bees, and let a rich man's house rob itself. That was on the 9th night. On the 10th morning she walked down to Draymore because the poor fund owed Corbin Wick 9 shillings, and found him standing in his own doorway with his hat in his hands. "It is all right, your grace," he said before she could say anything at all. "I am to be out by Lady Day. Mr. Pell has been very fair about it. There is a place at Marchbank for old men of the parish, and he has spoken for me himself. Mr. Wick, the orchard cannot be worked without you." "The orchard is to be sold," said Corbin. "Wick, 9 acres, and the cottages either side to a gentleman at Marchbank. It is for a debt of his Grace's, they do say. His Grace is a good man that has had a great sorrow, and a man is entitled to a sorrow, and I have had my 42 years here, which is more than most." He looked up, and his eyes were perfectly clear. "Do not tell him, your Grace. He has enough." And there it was, the whole machine standing in a lane in a wet February with its hat in its hands. Pell had never needed to be clever. He had only needed to be patient, and to build on other people's decency, one soft brick at a time. On a grieving man who would not look at his own accounts, on an old servant too loyal to complain, on tenants who would rather go without thatch than trouble his Grace, on a wife too frightened for her own skin to open her mouth. Every single person in it was being good. That was how it worked. A house full of good, frightened, considerate people could be taken apart plank by plank, and nobody would ever say a word, because every one of them had a private reason not to be the one who spoke. Alethea walked back up the lane and understood that she was in the machine, that she was in fact a load-bearing part of it, and that the only way out was the one thing she had spent her whole adult life avoiding. The tenants' supper was held every year in the great barn on the last Saturday in February, and had been for 80 years, and in the year of her marriage nobody had held it because nobody had thought of it. This year Alethea had held it. She had done the whole of it. 60 people, 4 tables, 200 beeswax candles. She had poured herself a roasted ox, and Mrs. Pinnock crying in the passage from pure professional happiness. Lady Theodosia was carried down in a chair and pronounced it the first evening at Ashcombe in 6 years that had not felt like a funeral. And at 8:30, the tenants of Draymore and Ashcombe stood up. They had made her a thing. It was a wooden box, oak, made by the wheelwright, with a bee cut into the lid by a man who had never carved anything in his life, and it was not very good, and inside it, in 9 separate, small papers, were 9 shillings and 4pence that they had put together among themselves, which was a sum Alethea understood to the last farthing, because she had thatched their roofs and knew exactly what those coins had cost. The wheelwright made a speech. It was 4 sentences long, and he got 2 of them wrong. Alethea stood up to answer him, as near to weeping as she had been since she was 14, and got as far as saying that she had never in her life been given anything, and the barn door opened. The Duke of Caldermere came in out of the dark with the rain on his shoulders, and Ottoline Charteris was on his arm. He had not been expected. He had said at dinner that he could not come. The whole room turned and stood, 60 people scraping back their benches, and the Duke of Caldermere looked down the length of his own barn at his wife standing at the head of the table with a wooden box in her hands, and he stopped. She watched him, understand it completely, in about 2 seconds, because he was not a stupid man, and had never been a stupid man. She watched him see the 200 candles and the 60 tenants and the ox and his great-aunt in the chair, and his wife with the box in her hands, and the whole of what this evening was and had cost and meant. And she watched him look down at the woman on his arm, who was standing in the doorway of a barn full of tenants who had known her face for a decade, and who had gone white, and who had not moved. The room waited. It was the most silent room Alethea had ever stood in. and she watched him look down at the woman on his arm who was standing in the doorway of a barn full of tenants who had known her face for 11 years and who had gone white and who had not moved. "Forgive us," said the Duke of Caldermere. "Mrs. Charteris has been unwell, and I would not have her stand about in the cold. We shall not stay." And he took her out, and the door shut, and 60 people sat down again and looked at their plates, and did not look at their Duchess at all. Then she thanked the wheelwright for his speech and said that she should keep the 9 shillings and 4 exactly as it was in the papers and not spend it, and that she would tell them why one day when there was more time. And she went round the 4 tables and spoke to every person at them by name, which took her 50 minutes, and ate a piece of the ox standing up in the passage afterward because she had not had any dinner. At 2 in the morning, she took out the plain deal box from under the bed and lifted her mother's willow queen cage off the top of it and looked at the bond underneath. £11,000, redeemable at her own word at any time after 7 years. There were 5 years and 8 months to run. She sat with it on her knee until it began to get light. She left on the 14th of March, which was a Tuesday, at 6:30 in the morning, and she went out through the still room door because it was the door she had come to think of as hers. She left a letter on the table in the estate office, where Pell would find it, because a letter to a husband may be lost or burned, but a letter left in a room with a witness is a document. It said that she was returning to Nettleford. It said that she made no claim on the estate and would take nothing out of it that she had not brought into it. It said that the 41 stocks in the orchard were the property of Ashcombe and were to be left in Mr. Corbin Wick's charge, and that he was to be kept on at his wage and in his cottage, and that this was the only request she made of anybody. It said nothing whatever about the bond or the house at Nettleford or Ottoline Charteris. She took 1 trunk of clothes and the plain deal box. Everything else stayed. The jewels stayed, all of it, in the case in the west. Room with the inventory folded on top of it in her own hand, correct to the last item, because she was not going to be a woman anybody could say a single word about. Her mother's veil stayed, folded in tissue in the drawer, with the labels she had never asked about. Lady Theodosia was awake. Of course she was awake. She was sitting up in the dark with a candle lit beside her, and had been for some time. "You are going," she said. "Sit down for 1 minute. You can spare me 1 minute." Alethea sat. "I said I would tell you about the year he was 23, when you were strong enough to hear it and stay. Well, you are strong enough now, and you are not staying, so I shall tell you anyway. You shall have it regardless. When he was 23, he asked her, and she said yes, and his father put a stop to it in one afternoon, because she had nothing. And my nephew was told, in this house, in this room, by a man he loved, that he might have her and lose the whole of it, or give her up and keep his people in their cottages. Her ruined hands did not move on the shawl. He gave her up. He was 23, and he did the thing that everybody in his life told him was correct, and he has spent the years since being very, very sure that he was wrong. And so he has kept the wound open on purpose," said Alethea slowly, "because if it ever healed, it would mean he had been right. Now that," she said, "is the first time in this family that anybody has said the true thing out loud, and it has taken a Chandler's daughter to do it. Go to Nettleford. I shall not tell you to stay, and I shall not write to you either, because if I write, you will answer, and if you answer, you will begin to hope, and I have watched 2 people ruined by hope in this house, and I have not the stomach for a third." "Certainly not," said Lady Theodosia, "but I have not been all right since 1811, and I have found it no great obstacle. Go away, child. You are letting the cold in." Hesketh was in the passage by the still-room door with a lantern. He did not say anything at all about it. He carried her trunk out to the carrier's cart himself, which he had no business doing at 62, and set it down and stood back. 44 years I've been in this house," he said, "and I have kept my opinions to myself in every one of them. and I find this morning that I have kept them so long they have gone off." He looked straight at her, which he had never once done. "You put out Vosper's torch on your wedding day. There is not one person in this house who has ever done a thing like that, including me, and I have watched 2 dukes go by. I should like your grace to know that I am aware of what is being lost here this morning, even if nobody else in the county is. Mr. Wick," she said when she could, in the letter, "please see it is done." "It will be done," said Hesketh, "if I have to thatch the cottage myself." And he stood in the lane in the dark, with the lantern up until the cart turned the corner, at the bottom, which is a thing carriers talk about, and this one did, for years. Nettleford is 11 miles from Ashcombe, and it took her 4 hours, and she was in her own back room on the market square by noon, with the shutters down and the ledgers out. Sowerby and Company had been run for 14 months by letter, by a woman writing at midnight in a west bedroom 11 miles away, and it had held together, but only just. Her manager, a good man out of his depth, had let the naval contract go to a firm at Marchbank, rather than take a risk on a price. There were 9 people on the wages, £412 in the bank, and a stock of wax gone soft in the warm autumn that would have to be rendered from the beginning. She got the naval contract back in the 2nd year by going to Marchbank herself in a hired gig, which no woman in that trade had ever done, and sitting in an outer office for 5 hours until the victualling agent agreed to see her out of sheer exhaustion. And then quoting a price 1 penny in the pound, better than the Marchbank firm, and holding to it for years without once being late. She bought the derelict tallow house at the bottom of Cordwainer Lane in the 3rd year for £220 and put a waxworks in it. She bought the derelict tallow house at the bottom of Cordwainer Lane in the 3rd year for £220 and put a waxworks in it. She put hives on the common and on 4 farms round it, on shares with the farmers, £20 of honey a year to them, and the wax to her, which nobody had ever thought of doing, and which every chandler in 3 counties was doing within 5 years. She had 340 stocks by the 6th. She employed 31 people by the 6th year, of whom 22 were women, and paid them a wage that made her extremely unpopular. At the Nettleford market, ordinary, and she did not care, and said so once in public in 11 words that were repeated in that town for a generation. She bought her Uncle Crispin Otway out of the trusteeship for £600, which was daylight robbery, and which she paid in a single draft without one word of argument, because a thing you have paid too much for is finally and completely yours. And in the 5th year she took the old sign down off the shop on the market square, the one that had said Sowerby and Son in flaking gold since before she was born, and had it repainted. The new sign said Sowerby and Company, wax, honey, and ship's lights. A. Sowerby, proprietor, Cod. It was the first time in her life that her own name had been on anything, and she stood in the square in the rain for a good while looking up at it, and a boy went past and asked her who A. Sowerby was, and she said that she had heard it was a widow. She did not write to Ashcombe, and Ashcombe did not write to her, and the county said what counties say, which is a great deal for about 8 months and then nothing at all. Lady Theodosia died in the 3rd year, in her chair in the yellow room, in the afternoon with the whole of the light on her. Alethea read it in the Marchbank paper 4 days later, standing in the shop, and put the paper down and served 2 customers, and then went into the back room and shut the door for a quarter of an hour. 6 weeks after that, an attorney came from Marchbank with a small parcel. Lady Theodosia had left her nothing at all, which Alethea understood perfectly and was grateful for. The parcel was not a legacy. It was a plain oak box with a bee cut badly into the lid, containing 9 separate small papers and 9 shillings and 4pence, and a note in a hand gone entirely to pieces with age. The note said, "You left this on the table. You will want it. It is the only money in that house that anybody earned." And in the 6th year, an old man came to the door of the waxworks with a bundle on his back and no hat, Corbin Wick was 76. He had been turned out of his cottage in the spring, when the 9 acres and the orchard and the cottages either side were finally sold, and he had walked, in stages, over 4 days, 11 miles. Alethea was in the yard with her sleeves tied back and a rendering pan going. She looked up and saw him at the gate and put down the skimmer and crossed the yard. And she did not exclaim, and she did not embrace him, because he would have hated both. And she said, "Mr. Wick, there are 340 stocks on this book, and 1 man to see to them, and he is not equal to it. I can offer you 14 shillings a week and the room over the counting house, and I would want you to start today, because we are behind." "Mrs. Sowerby," said the old man, and picked up the smoker off the bench, and that was the whole of their agreement for the next 4 years. What Nettleford saw was a woman of 30 in a plain dark gown crossing the market square at 6:30 in the morning with a bunch of keys at her waist, 6 premises with her name on them, 31. People who worked for her, and who, when a stranger asked about her in the public house, went briefly and completely wooden in the face, which is the highest compliment the English working man has ever devised. A firm that supplied wax to 4 parish churches, 2 naval victuallers, and though nobody made much of it, the whole of the county jail. At cost, on a standing order she had placed herself and never explained. "She is not keeping a shop," said the carrier, in the tap-room at Draymore, to a man who had asked whether it was true that the Duchess of Caldermere kept one. "The shop is keeping about 30 families. And I will tell you another thing for nothing. She were a duchess for 14 months, and nobody in this valley could tell you one thing. She done. She been a chandler 6 year, and I can name you 11. It was the last week of October, and it had been raining since Sunday, when the man in the dark coat came into the yard at Cordwainer Lane. Alethea did not see him arrive. She was at the far end of it with her back to the gate and both hands in a swarm. It was a ridiculous time of year for a swarm, and a ridiculous place thrown that morning, onto the axle of a loaded dray in the middle of the yard, and there were 4 grown men round it doing every single thing wrong. Her carter had a sack. Her drayman had a bucket of water. A boy had been sent for straw, which told her somebody had suggested burning them, and she had a very good idea which of them it had been. "Put it down," Alethea said. "All of it. Back to the wall, and do not run." And she took off her gloves and went in. She heard the gate. She did not turn round, because you do not turn round with the queen in your hand, and she stayed where she was, with her fingers in the cluster, and her cheek almost against the wet iron of the axle. Somebody had come into her yard and stopped. She was aware of it the way she was aware of weather. "Mr. Barrow," she said, "whoever that is, they are to stand still and be quiet, and if they will not, they are to be put out into the lane. I am not particular which." Then a voice she had not heard in 6 years said, "I can stand still. I have had a great deal of practice." Alethea's hands did not move. That was the thing she was proudest of afterward, and the thing that surprised her most at the time. Her hands went on doing what they were doing, gently, in among 30,000 bees, because they had been doing it since she was 9 years old, and they did not require her assistance. She found the queen. She took her out between finger and thumb, and put her into the plain willow cage that had been her mother's, and shut it, and held it up level with her shoulder, and waited the 2 minutes it takes the note changed. The swarm came up off the axle in a roll, and settled on her hand and her arm, and the whole right side of her. The note changed. The swarm came up off the axle in a roll, and settled on her hand and her arm and her shoulder, and the whole right side of her. The Duke of Caldermere was standing just inside the gate of her yard with the rain running off the brim of his hat, and his coat black with it, and he was thinner than he had been, and there was gray at his temples that had not been there, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at a rumor that has turned out to be a building. Behind him, through the open gate, she could see a hired gig and a tired horse, which meant he had come the 11 miles himself in this, without a servant. Behind him, through the open gate, she could see a hired gig and a tired horse, which meant he had come the 11 miles himself, in this, without a servant. Alethea stood in the rain in her own yard, with 3 pounds of bees on her arm and her name on the wall behind her, and looked at him for what the drayman afterward swore was a full quarter of a minute. "Mr. Barrow," she said at last, without taking her eyes off him, "fetch me a skep and take that straw out of the yard before I find out who sent for it." She made him wait 40 minutes. It was not cruelty, and it was not calculation. There was a swarm to be hived, and a swarm does not care who is standing in the gate. She hived them, and washed her hands and arms to the elbow at the pump in cold water, and only then did she cross the yard. "You had better come into the counting-house," she said. He sat where she put him on the wrong side of the desk, in the chair her carrier sat in when they wanted more money. No, he turned his hat over once. "I shall be plain, because I have had 11 miles to practice it. There is a bond of your making against the Ashcombe estate for £11,000, and it became callable at your word in July. My new man of business found it in a drawer in August and has been unable to sleep since. You may call it. That is what I came to say. You may call it, and it will finish us. And it is yours, and I will not send an attorney to argue about a thing that was never mine. I have written it a dozen times in 6 years and burned every one, and a 13th would have been a cowardice, so I came. Your Grace," she said, "before you say anything else, I want you to understand that I have never in 6 years intended to call that bond, and that I have never once told anybody so, because a woman on her own does better to be thought dangerous." She got up and unlocked the press behind the desk and took out a book. It was small and thick, and the corners had gone soft and the spine had been resewn twice, and she put it on the desk and turned it round so that it faced him. "That is the second book I ever kept. I began it in November of the year I married you, and I have not stopped." "That is the second book I ever kept," she said. "I began it in November of the year I married you, and I have not stopped." She let him read for 4 or 5 minutes, which is a long time in a quiet room, and watched him do it, and saw the thing she had known for 6 years would happen if she ever got the chance to show a clever man an honest column, which is that he did not need any of it explained to him. "600 a year," he said at last. "Pell, Pell." He turned a page and stopped. 611 on the average of the last 4 years I was there. Out of an estate that was carrying 9 acres of dead orchard and 9 roofs of rotten thatch, that is, the house at Nettleford, he said. "I shall not pretend to you about it." His voice had gone very level. "I paid for that house from the year my father died until the year you left. I do not ask you to forgive it, and I would rather you did not try. I have never lied about it, and I am not going to begin in your own counting house." "Good," said Alethea. "Then answer me a question of business. What did you pay a year for the coal, for the fires? It is a cold house. It faces north. £10 a year. By that book, for the last 6 years I had sight of it. What is the coal for?" "It faces south," said Alethea, "onto Sheep Street, and it has been let to a corn chandler's family since the spring of the year I left, and it has a range and no grate in any room above stairs, and Mrs. Charteris has never lived in it in her life." The fire moved. Outside in the yard somebody dropped a pail and was told to be quiet. She lives in 2 rooms over Holloway's music shop. She has lived there since the year I left. She teaches the pianoforte to farmers' daughters at 9 pence the hour and takes 14 pupils a week, and last winter she took in plain sewing, and I know all of it because this is my town. "That is not possible," he said quietly. "She had 180 a year of me. I settled it myself." "You settled it on Mr. Pell," said Alethea, "and Mr. Pell settled about 1/5 of it on her, and kept the rest, along with 600 a year of your estate, and rather a lot of my money, and I have known it for 5 years, and I did not write to tell you." She held his eyes. You may put that in the account against me. I told myself it was not my affair, and it was not, and I have never once believed myself. There is worse, she said. I would rather you had it all in one afternoon than in pieces. For the rest of your life, she took an envelope out of the drawer and set it beside the book. It was old and soft and had never been opened. Mrs. Charteris gave me that in the spring, in the street, without one word of explanation. And I have not opened it, and I am not going to. It is her own copy of a letter she wrote to you. She wrote 2 before it. She asked you to release her and let her go to her sister at Bristol, and she wrote in the 1st year and the 3rd year and the 6th, and every one of them went into the Ashcombe post bag at the Nettleford receiving house, and every one of them went through the hands of the man who fetched the Ashcombe post. He could not let her go, said Alethea. You must see it. That house was the pipe. Every quarter for a decade and more there was a large sum leaving your estate that no honest man was ever going to ask you a question about, because it was the one page of your accounts that a gentleman would rather die than have read aloud. He did not steal in the dark, he stole behind your grief, and he needed the grief kept exactly where it was. And so he kept it there, and it cost him nothing but a little paper. He took something out of the breast of his coat and put it on the desk between them, folded in tissue that had gone yellow. It was her mother's veil. I found it in the drawer in the west room, he said, with the labels, 4 years ago. I have taken it out perhaps 200 times, and I could never think of one thing to do with it that was not an insult. He looked at it. I signed everything that man put in front of me for a decade and more, because signing was easier than reading it, and reading it was easier than looking at what I did when I was 23. I have not been robbed, madam. I have been paying a man to keep me exactly as I was, and he did the work I asked of him, and he did it very well. Not the whole. I had the 600 and the 4 pounds of thatch, and a house with no name on it, and I had no proof of anything, and a great deal to lose. She folded her hands. And I was 26, and I had watched you walk into a barn full of my tenants, and walk out again, and I could not think about your accounts and that on the same night. So I went home. It is not a noble answer, it is the true one. Why did you never call the bond? Why did you never call the bond? Because Corbin Wick was still in his cottage in the 1st year, said Alethea, and the 9 roofs at Draymore were still on. If I had called it, you would have sold the whole valley in a fortnight to a gentleman at Marchbank who would have put the rents up at Lady Day. She shrugged. You are welcome to make that into a compliment. I have always found it more useful to think of it as arithmetic. She walked to Sheep Street the following morning, and went up the outside stair by the music shop, and knocked. Adeline Charteris was 37. She had a good coat that had been turned, and there was a pianoforte in the room and very little else, and she looked at Alethea in the doorway for about 3 seconds, and then stood back to let her in, which was, Alethea thought, an extremely brave thing to do. He came then, said Adeline. Yesterday. He came then, said Adeline. I have not come to say anything. I have come to ask you something, and then to offer you something. Did you want him? Did you want him? Adeline Charteris laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, and it was not meant to be. I was 22, she said, and I had nothing, and I was very nearly beautiful, and he was the first person in my life who looked at me as though I were an event rather than a difficulty. Of course I wanted him. And then his father put a stop to it in one afternoon, and I was married inside the year to a man who drank, and I buried him and found he had left me 110 pounds and a great many creditors. And by the time your husband came back into my life, I was 31, and what I wanted was a roof. She lifted her chin. So no, I did not want him. I wanted not to be frightened, and he could pay for that, and I let him, and I have been ashamed of it every single day since. He never got your letters, said Alethea. All 3 of them went to Pell. Adeline turned her face away to the window, and her hands, which had been perfectly steady, went into her lap and gripped one another. 11 years, she said. 11 years, she said. I thought he had read them and simply preferred not to answer. She said it almost lightly. One can survive a great deal, you know, if one is allowed to think the other person is a monster. It is very hard work indeed to find out he was only a fool who never opened the post. Alethea let that stand for a moment. Then she said, "There are 31 people on my books and 1 clerk, and my clerk is 60 and going blind and will not admit it. I want somebody who can keep a ledger, write a hand that a victualling agent will take seriously, and go to Marchbank and frighten him when he is slow to pay. £80 a year, the room over the counting house when Mr. Wick has done with it, and Michaelmas and Christmas. I do not want you. I want a clerk. You are the only person in this town who has spent a decade being looked at by everybody, and has not once cried about it in the street. And I am told you were the only creature at Ashcombe who ever got the better of Osric Pell in an argument, which is more than I managed." Alethea stood up. "And it will be by deed, in your own name, and you will owe it to nobody." "Not to him. Least of all to me." "Why?" said Adeline. It came out of her badly torn, not graceful at all. "Because you and I were bought with the same money," said Alethea. "And only one of us has ever been allowed to spend any of it. Good morning, Mrs. Charteris. I open at 7. The Michaelmas supper at Cordwainer Lane was held on the last Saturday in September in the yard under a canvas, and had been every year since the 3rd year, and it was the one night in the 12th month that the waxworks stood cold. 31 people sat down. So did the Nettleford carrier, and the corn factor, and Halloway from the music shop, and the victualling agent's clerk down from Marchbank, who had come for the accounts and stayed for the beef, and about 40 of the town who had not been invited and had come anyway, which was the tradition. Alethea paid for it that year, as she had every year, out of the oak box. She had spent 9 shillings and 4 pence of it in the 3rd year, and put 9 shillings and 4 pence back in the 4th, and by now the original coins had long gone round the town and come home again half a dozen times, and every person in that yard knew the story. Hesketh arrived at 6. He came on the Ashcombe carrier with 1 box, having given notice at Ashcombe after 50 years and 2 months, and he stood at the gate in his good black coat looking at 400 weight of beef and a canvas full of chandlers, and did not know what to do with his hands. Alethea took him up onto the mounting block in front of all of them. Alethea took him up onto the mounting block in front of all of them. "Most of you know this gentleman by sight," she said, "and none of you know what he did. 6 years ago, I left a house at 6:30 in the morning, with 1 trunk, and every person in it had reasons to say nothing to me. And this man carried my box out to the cart himself at 62 years of age, and stood in the lane with a lantern up until I was round the corner, and told me to my face that he knew what was being lost. He was the only one. He was right, and he was 6 years early." She looked down at him. "Mr. Hesketh, you have the room at the top of the counting-house stair, and £80 a year, and I do not much mind what you do for it." The Duke of Caldermere came to the gate at 8:30. The Duke of Caldermere came to the gate at 8:30. He had walked from the Marchbank Road. He stood in the gateway of a yard belonging to somebody else, with his hat in his hand, in front of about 70 people who all knew precisely who he was, and precisely what he had done in a barn 6 years before, and he did not come in. The canvas went quiet by degrees the way a room does. "Madam," he said, across the whole length of it, "may I come into your yard?" There was not a soul in that yard who would have blamed her. She could feel it coming off the tables like heat. 70 people entirely prepared to watch a duke turned into the lane, and some of them hoping for it. "Mr. Barrow," she said, "there is a place at the bottom of the 2nd table. Give his grace a plate." He came in and sat where he was put, between a drayman and a woman who rendered wax, and he was given beef on a plate that did not match. And he ate it, and he talked to the drayman about the Marchbank Road for the better part of an hour, and the drayman afterwards said that he was a civil enough fellow considering. At 11 o'clock, when the canvas was down and the trestles were stacked and the yard was empty but for the two of them and a boy sweeping, he found her by the rendering pans. "I have no right to ask you anything," he said. "No," Alethea agreed. "None at all. Ask it." "I have no right to ask you anything," he said. She let him get to the end of it, which took him some time and did not go smoothly, and she thought that was rather to his credit. Then she said no. She said it gently, and she said it immediately, because she had learned a long time ago that a kind refusal delivered slowly is the cruelest thing there is. "Not to you," she said, "to the shape of it. You are asking me to come back to Ashcombe and be the Duchess of Caldermere. I am not going to do that. Not this year, and not in 10 years. Not because of what you did." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Because of what I would have to stop. There are 340 stocks on this book and 31 families and a naval contract that took me 5 hours in an outer office to get. And there is a sign in that lane with my own name on it, which is the first time my name has ever been on anything. I have been a duchess. I did it for 14 months. I was extremely good at it, and not one person in that valley could tell you a single thing I did. I would go back to being a room that people are shown. I did not walk 11 miles out of that, to walk 11 miles back into it. A great deal, if you wanted enough to do it badly for a while." Alethea leaned against the pan. "You may come here. Not as a visitor, and not once a quarter with a carriage. There is a room over the stable, and a man in Marchbank who has been robbing me on carriage rates for 2 years, because I have not had the time to go and sit in his office, and I have been waiting a long while for somebody with nothing better to do, and a great deal of patience. You would be extremely bad at it for about a year, and after the year we should both know something we do not know now, which is whether you actually wanted me, or whether you wanted somebody to have chosen." She held his eyes. "You have spent a decade being sure you chose wrong at 23. I am not going to be the correction. I will not be the second half of somebody else's argument with his father. He took that. It went into him visibly, and he did not defend himself, and Alethea thought that 6 years ago he could not have done that, and that it was possibly the only thing about the whole business that gave her any hope at all. 2 conditions, she said. The first is Mrs. Charteris. There is a deed drawn at Bellamy's giving her £80 a year of my money in her own name, and she has not signed it because she has some notion of not taking my charity, and she will take yours, because she thinks she has earned it, and she is right. You will settle 200 a year on her by deed, absolutely, not through any man of business, not revocable, and you will do it before you say one further word to me about myself. Alethea's voice did not rise at all. She is not to be provided for. She is to be made impossible to provide for. There is a difference, and it is the whole of it. And the second is the 9 acres. She called the bond in October exactly as the Nettleford attorney had written it when she was 23 and had trusted nobody. She did not take a penny of it out of Ashcombe. She took it in the form of the 9 acres of orchard and the 9 cottages at Draymore, bought back at a loss from the gentleman at Marchbank who had let the roofs go, and she put the whole of it into a trust of 9 names, the tenants being the 9 names, and the rents of it going to the repair of it and nowhere else forever. It was hers to give. She had made it herself, out of wax in a back room at midnight, over 8 years. That is the one kind of property that nobody can ever come and take back off you, and she had known it since she was 14. Osric Pell was taken up at Marchbank in the November, and went to the assizes in the spring, and it was found that he had had rather more than £9,000 out of the Ashcombe estate over that time, of which about 400 remained. What could be restored was restored. What could not was made good by the Duke of Caldermere out of the sale of the London house, and he counted it cheap. Alethea did not go to the assizes. She said afterward that a man being sentenced gave her exactly the same satisfaction as a column that finally adds, and no more. Adeline Charteris signed both deeds in the same week, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and was clerk to Sowerby and Company for 2 years, and its partner for 19 after that, and she was very much better at frightening the Marchbank agent than Alethea had ever been. The two women never became friends exactly. They became something more durable, which is two people who have been in the same fire and do not have to discuss it. Corbin Wick died at 82 in the room over the counting house with the window open onto the yard in June at the height of the swarming season, which he would have chosen. Alethea was with him. He said nothing memorable at all, which she was glad of. Hesketh lived to be 80 and never did work out what his £80 a year was for, and did it beautifully. The Duke of Caldermere took the room over the stable, and was, as promised, extremely bad at everything for the better part of a year. He went to Marchbank and sat in an outer office for 6 hours, which the whole of Nettleford heard about within a day, and enjoyed enormously. Ashcombe went on, smaller, solvent, with 9 acres it no longer owned. Standing in fruit behind it, the east chamber was opened and given to a housekeeper, there being one again at last. Nobody put flowers in it any more, and that was not a cruelty. It was simply that the woman it had been kept for was alive, and 11 miles away, and busy. They did not remarry, having never been unmarried. What happened instead took 4 years, and is not the kind of thing that can be put into a sentence, and it happened almost entirely in a counting house, between 6 and 7 in the morning, which is when the two of them were both awake and neither was anybody's duke or anybody's proprietor. On a warm evening at the end of that 4th summer, he came looking for her and found her where he had half known he would, at the desk in the counting house with the yard door open and one candle lit. Her mother's veil was folded in the drawer at her left hand. Her mother's willow queen cage, worth about 2pence, lay on the desk where it had lain every working day for 22 years. "You have got the whole of it into good order," he said from the doorway. "There is nothing left to save. What are you going to do with yourself now?" Alethea looked up at him across the one candle, level and gray-eyed, and entirely unafraid, exactly as she had looked up at him from 4 inches of rainwater in the forecourt of Ashcombe, with a swarm on her arm. "I shall find something," she said. "I always do. Come in. You are standing in my light." She had married at 24 because she was tired of being the only wakeful person in her own life, and she had kept one door unlocked behind her, in the bottom of a plain deal box, because she had never entirely believed she would be allowed to stay. It had taken her until she was 36 to understand what that door had actually been. It was not a way out. It was the only room in her whole life that she had ever owned outright, and everything she had afterward, the yard and the name on the sign and the man in the doorway with the light behind him, she had built by walking through it.